So last week we did a brief introduction to the Vimalakirti Sutra. So tonight we're going to go start actually looking into the sutra. So as I mentioned last week, this is an opportunity for us to use primary source texts, actual scriptural texts in our study of Buddhism. So rather than read a book about Buddhism or read a book about the sutra, we'll actually read the sutra and then learn Buddhist concepts that way. I find that that's done less often these days, and what better source than the actual source? So that's what we'll be using. So I posted online the PDF of the sutra that we'll be using. No particular reason why we're using that one other than the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai or the BDK translations. They do track to the original Chinese pretty well. So if people are interested, you can actually cross-reference. And then there's a whole series. So you can, at least the committee that's produced them has been the same general committee. So if we go on to other sutras, it's easy to choose another one in that series and also obtain the PDF, and everybody can be on the same page. You don't have to worry about, I have a copy that was published in the 60s versus somebody has their reprint and there being differences in page numbers and that kind of thing. So it's an easy way to stay on track, and it's a good resource, and it's free. So it's very, very nice in that respect. So why the Vimalakirti Sutra? Every Asian nation, every school of Buddhism has its favorite text, or a text that it really upholds as being important. The Vimalakirti Sutra has had a kind of a unique position in East Asia, so China, Korea, Japan, other Mahayana countries that have drawn on Chinese tradition, like Vietnam, quite heavily, of being sort of famous because the main actor or character or person featured in the sutra is a layperson. So rather than it being completely in dialogue between the Buddha and monks, here you have this layperson. So people naturally gravitated towards reading the text and finding it interesting. And if you have a character in any text that you can identify with more closely, then it's easier to read and easier to relate to. So I think the text was very relatable. The other thing is Vimalakirti was a merchant. He was somebody who had status. He was also intellectual. So for those intellectuals who are reading, and of course we're talking about a time when people were largely illiterate, so the people who were literate were generally intellectuals who were classically trained, so they had a grounding in Confucian thinking and maybe even some Taoist texts. This was a person that they could identify with. Here was someone who, at least on the outside, exhibited sort of a normal life. Had a family, had position, had to go to business meetings and that kind of thing. But in his spare time had become very cultivated. So it presented another avenue for practice. So obviously not everybody wants to become a monk, and that's fine. So here's Vimalakirti as a good example of, well, how do you practice if you're not a monastic? If you're not going to shave your head and don robes or leave the householder life, how do you actually practice? What does that look like? So Vimalakirti is that example. So this is one of the reasons why this particular text was pretty popular. And the other thing you can look at is it's a really good overview of a lot of Buddhist teaching. So while there's not a Vimalakirti school of Buddhism, so to speak, or where the school puts a lot of focus on this particular text as their primary text, it is one that gives you a really good overview of a lot of the major ideas within Mahayana Buddhism. So for that reason, I thought it would be good to use it as a way to carry on our weekly Dharma talks and give us a chance to use something that we can actually pick up and start reading the sutras. So generally reading scripture isn't very exciting, but this one is different in that respect, that it is intellectually stimulating, and there are twists and turns and parts that are sort of head scratchers and things that you wouldn't normally expect to see in a scriptural text. It probably reads more like a novel or kind of a mind-bending short story. You may be able to compare it to The Matrix or something, I don't know, but some interesting components. The other reason why I think it's good is because it's relatable, because the main character is not a monk, it might be useful for the process of localization. So if we're trying to localize Buddhism to a new country, how do we actually, what is our model? What is the ideal layperson? And so how can we, practice that in this country? So I think in many ways it could be, a good example of that component. So our background music. So we'll start with the title. Typically we'll be referring to it as the Vimalakirti Sutra. Sometimes it's referred to as the Vimalakirti Manjushri, since the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri is the other primary person speaker in the text. And it's also, if you look at the copy that I sent out, often referred to as the inconceivable emancipation. So one title of the text is, who are the main characters or the main actors in the text? The other title refers to what is the goal of the text, or what type of insight does the text provide. And it's inconceivable because it is the realization of the Buddhas, and that's not our realization, not yet anyway. So to that degree, it's considered inconceivable, or some very deep insight and emancipation, because it's leading us towards enlightenment and emancipation from our current state. So those are the generally two ways that it's referred to. So that's very typical for a lot of, especially in Chinese traditions, for the sutra lecture to start with the actual title of the text. And sometimes just lecturing on the title, I've heard lectures, 2 hours just on the title. So I'm not going to do that tonight, because that classical method, we'll ease into introducing all the classical methods, but that's why we have different names for the text. So it also is helpful maybe to revisit, what is a sutra? Why do we use sutra and not Bible or something along those lines? So sutra refers to the idea of a thread, a string, something that's sewn together. And traditionally that was the actual pages were sewn. So if you look at ancient books, they're sewn bindings or sewn by hand. But it also gives the idea of, what is sewn together. And it's kind of like a garland of flowers, if we were in Hawaii, LA. So you have this, something that's very beautiful, something that's beneficial, something that perfumes. So it's not just a book, but it's a collection of ideas and concepts that actually have benefit, that adorn the person who's reading it, adorns the mind. And so the ideas behind the title of sutra become more broad if you look at it that way. So in this way, it's not, I read that once, kind of an approach. It's something that you might refer back to or read multiple times and see from different angles. So I know a lot of people, especially on summer break, they have the habit of reading the same book every summer. So some people, they say, I read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit every year. So it's not reading it in that context of sort of, I'm going to escape and relax with it. It's, I'm going to revisit the text and glean additional wisdom, or revive this ideas or the teaching in my mind. So that may be a reason why we actually read it more than once. So we're going to go in a more traditional route, kind of line by line, but I'll try not to belabor any particular points, so that we still have room for questions and dialogue. So the sutra starts off, thus have I heard. At one time, the Buddha was in the garden of Amrapali near Vaisali in the company of a great congregation of 8,000 bhikshus. There were 32,000 bodhisattvas recognized by the congregation. So this starts off with the traditional formula of a sutra, thus have I heard. So most sutras start off this way, and it's generally one of the Buddhist disciples recalling literally what they heard. So this formulation has a couple purposes. One, it's sort of the stock formula for Buddhist texts, but it also tells you who heard it, who was there, and it's sort of the stamp of authority or authentication. So generally it was the Buddhist disciple Ananda who was doing the hearing, and at there were several councils, Buddhist councils, where the texts were put together and recounted. What did you hear? And this is where we get this. Thus have I heard. So it also acknowledges that the texts are largely an oral tradition. So literally, this is what they heard, and then it was passed on orally initially, and then only later written, put down in a written form. So this is also why you see in Buddhist texts kind of a narrative portion and then a verse section. So it was traditional in India for text to be, or any teaching to be transmitted orally, and it was in a poetry or prose, I guess a poetic form, so you could sing it. So the human mind is interesting. If it's song lyrics, you can remember a lot of them, so if you sing it, but if you just try to memorize text directly, it's very difficult. So if you actually create in a poetic sense or set it to a rhythm, it's easier to remember. So this is one of the reasons why we chant. So a lot of people probably over time will memorize the Heart Sutra, but if you say, say the Heart Sutra, so the same reason why you learn your ABCs with the song, right? Easier to remember that way. And so if people say, what comes after L, you're like, A, B, C, D, E, F, you have to sing it to remember. So that's actually the way we keep knowledge. You also see this tendency for people who have brain damage. They may be able to sing songs but not speak. So it's utilizing different parts of the mind and different capacities. So it's also interesting that this thus have I heard is sort of attesting to the fact that the Buddha said this and there was someone there to hear it. So it also tells you something about the audience, that there was a audience for this teaching. It's not so-and-so sat by the lake, thought of this and wrote it down. So it's talking to you not only that this was a lecture given to somebody, but it's also, I think, inviting you to ask, well, who was listening and what was the capacity of the audience? So if the audience is different, your teaching is going to be different. So the next part of the formula is, thus have I heard at such and such a place, so-and-so heard it, right? So it's going to tell you where it was spoken and who was listening. So if you compare it to maybe like a college lecture, Professor Smith was lecturing at, in lecture room 42 to a class of second year. So it's going to tell you right away information that may be helpful for understanding the lecture. So let's say you're going to go back and study and you're trying to find, I'm trying to find advanced thermodynamics. So that's an undergraduate class. I'm going to go to find the right lecture for me. So it's actually very helpful in that respect to bring that knowledge together and have that as part of the beginning. We have the same example, I guess you could say, in Christian texts. So you have the Gospels are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So actually who wrote it and maybe something about the author and why they recorded what they did and their perspective, or where they pick up the story and why. So having that background knowledge is helpful even for the study and understanding of the sutras as well. So all that's there. So you have this formula in the beginning. So paying attention a little bit and researching a little bit about the very beginning of the sutra could be pretty helpful. So when were the sutras written? So the first Buddhist council was about 400 BCE. The monks came together and this is where, I heard this. And so we have the thus have I heard. So the monks actually got together and there was a agreement on what the sutras were and what the monastic discipline was. So there were two primary monks that tremendous knowledge and memories were sort of, if this is the way I heard it, everybody go, we agree that's what was said. And so that was like the first council to kind of confirm what the Buddha said and start that tradition going. So there's not much, I guess, scholarly or historic disagreement on that point. So you can actually go back to the first council. So throughout time, there's been various Buddhist councils. Some of them were larger, some were smaller. The most recent one was in the 50s in Burma. So they actually got together, a lot of the monks from the Theravada tradition, and had an additional Buddhist council to make a more authoritative and updated version of the text. So that's been the tradition from the beginning. The elders of the tradition get together and have this council. So there's been several. Of course, these days you can have like a World Buddhist Congress, people can fly and get together. In Hill days, it's a lot of pre-planning of who's going to come when, and most likely a lot of travel difficulties and that kind of thing. So that's interesting tidbit. So I'll try not to belabor any of these points because, of course, we could talk about the individual Buddhist councils forever. We could talk about who was present and what was said, but it's good to know that these councils were there. It's sort of very similar to the Christian tradition, where you have the First Council of Nicaea, and what books are going to go into the Bible and why, who was there, what texts were thrown out, what was considered authoritative and what wasn't. So that tells you a lot about this text that people use called the Bible. So if you look at the the set of texts, because it's massive, that we have as the Buddhist canon, it tell you a lot about first how long that council must have been to bring all those things together, and then just the capacity of the people to remember it and hold on to those things and transmit it to us. So as I mentioned last time, part of this purpose of actually going through the sutra is, even if you don't have full understanding, is to generate a little bit more appreciation for the texts that we do have and where they came from and what we can get out of them. So this is part sutra study, part sutra appreciation. So, so the at one time, so we have thus have I heard at one time. This is kind of get to know your audience portion of the text. So it's important, right? Important to know your audience. If you do any kind of public speaking or you're going to give a talk, that's the first advice, right? Know your audience. So about 20 years ago, I had occasion to give a talk about a high-tech product. I was working in the high-tech industry at that time. And we had a product we were selling, and I had two talks on the same product. One talk was geared toward engineers, and the other talk was geared towards the salespeople. Same product, same desire, we got to sell it. Two totally different talks. And it was important to know the audience. So at one point, I had a mixed audience, so I had to kind of go back and forth between the two and on the fly create a talk that would keep both audiences engaged. But the salespeople didn't want to know all the voltages and serial connectors and all those kind of things, but the engineers did. And the engineers weren't much interested in volume pricing and discounts and market positioning, but the salespeople were. So this is a good example, I think, of where different texts are given and spoken at different levels, depending on the audience. So sometimes we're looking at Buddhist texts and we can say, look backwards now, having all of them, and say, well, at this point you can see the Buddha begins to prepare the audience for an idea. Later, there's a little bit more added, and then there's a text further down the road that fully explores that idea. But if you start off with the deeper, full explanation, you haven't really laid the groundwork. So it's not that necessarily the texts are contradictory or they explain things differently, but it's a step by step. So if you're looking at where in the 49 years of the Buddha's life that he taught this particular idea, you may see a progression. So that's, I think, kind of natural. So chapter 1. So chapter 1 starts off with this, thus have I heard. At one time, the Buddha was in the garden of Amrapali near Vaishali. So where is that? The garden of Amrapali. So Amrapali was a person. She was a courtesan in ancient India. And what does it mean to be a courtesan? It's kind of a polite way of saying she was an entertainer. So she was renowned for her beauty and for her dancing. But this was a time when women didn't have a lot of rights, of course. So due to her beauty, the tradition of the time was if you were so beautiful, to avoid men fighting over you, you belonged to all the men. So you could pay and enjoy her company for the evening. So Amrapali had become quite wealthy from her profession, and she owned quite a bit of land and had quite a bit of wealth, and was often invited to dance or for people to enjoy her company, at the higher levels of society. So the city of Vaishali was very wealthy, said to be very beautiful. There were a lot of gardens, a lot of lotus ponds. So she owned one of the gardens in the city. And it was in one of the gardens, eventually she would donate those gardens to the Buddha and the monks, and that's where they resided. So in ancient times, you could just go out in the wilderness and practice. Today, there's no, I guess you could do it out west here, public lands, right? So find some BLM land and meditate. But it's still, at some point, it's either privately or publicly owned. There's no just full-on wilderness other than what, Antarctica, nobody owns. The moon, so that's all we have left. It's not easy to get to Antarctica, nor is it really conducive to building a temple there. So somebody has to donate, or you have to buy some land if you want to put a temple. So it was not uncommon for princes and nobles and things like that to donate land to the Buddha and monks. So that's how most of the initial lands came to the Sangha, to the monks, as practice places. They were set aside in that respect. So Amrapali was one of those people who donated space, you could say, to the Buddha. So it was a mango grove. So it was a grove of mango trees. So this is where the monks took up residence. And being that it's South Asia and India, it's kind of near the border of Nepal, it's temperate, so you could just sit outside and be okay. So it's, this is not a good time to be in the Bahamas considering the approaching hurricane, but if we were in the Florida Keys or the Bahamas or San Diego or something, we could just do this on the beach and that would be fine. The weather would be very nice. Hawaii, safer. Okay, we'll go. We'll move our operation to Hawaii. Yeah, not yet. Okay. But you could have, it's not going to get so cold at night that you're going to freeze, and it's not, going to get so miserably hot during the day that shade won't be, your salvation. So, very conducive to someone donating a forest to you and just being able to take up residence there. So Amrapali is said, heard of the Buddha's teaching, and was very interested in hearing his teaching. So there's various versions of the story. She's also known, her beauty was so great. Let's just say there was bloodshed involved and people competing for her affections, and maybe not too unlike Helen of Troy. She moved men to the worst of themselves due to her beauty, and I'm sure the dancing enticed, got certain fires burning, so to speak. So Amrapali hears of the Buddha in the area teaching, and one version says she went to hear the teaching, and another says she directly heard of him and wanted to invite him to dinner. So she goes to the Buddha, invites him to dinner, and eventually he accepts the invitation. So you have to think, here is the Buddha with the monks, and you have a woman who's engaged in this profession, and he accepts her invitation to dinner. It's kind of unexpected, right, to say the least. But I think what you're, again, read between the lines of a lot of Buddhist texts, there's a consideration given here to the plight of women at that time. Understanding, to reject outright is kind of cutting off the ability of Amrapali to hear the teaching. But the Buddha does caution the other monks, watch yourselves, don't become infatuated with her, because it's easy to do. So I don't know what would be, I don't keep up with Hollywood and that kind of thing, but I don't know who would be, the equivalent where people would be like, what? They're going there to, that's a scandal, But it wasn't the place that a lot of people would expect the Buddha to accept an invitation. So the Buddha goes to dinner at Amrapali's home. It said that the home was very beautiful, and she made it even more beautiful, decorated and whatnot for his arrival, and offered food to the Buddha and the monks. Amrapali, through this interaction, eventually arouses the desire to become a nun. So she actually does donate all of her wealth and her lands to the monks and nuns, and she herself becomes a nun. So as I mentioned before, there was no, it says that Amrapali was born an orphan. She was left under a fruit tree. So her name actually means kind of like beneath the leaves of the fruit tree or something along these lines. And you know, not having status but having this great beauty, she's sort of forced into this world. So the only escape at that time, the only way for a woman to be free of kind of these social constraints is to become a nun. So you know, Buddhism really does offer one of the first women's liberation, you know, movements or abilities. On the one hand, it's quite unfortunate that that's the only way out of that life. But I think, you know, here you have the opportunity to do something different, to get out of this objectification and these kind of things. So knowing that background, and it's quite interesting, you know, how the sutra starts and where it's being preached. So a lot of very important Buddhist texts were spoken in this garden. So once the grove was given to the monks, even the Buddha's very last sermon was preached there. So this is the site for a lot of Buddhist texts. As I mentioned before, Vaishali is a very rich city, or at the time was a very rich city, very prosperous. Today it's just filled with cultural treasures, archaeological treasures. There's a Japanese Buddhist group that built a huge stupa there for world peace. So it's quite a destination in terms of, you know, Buddhist history and religious practice. You can see a lot of very interesting historical artifacts still there. It was still a place for pilgrimage even into the 4th, 5th, 6th century. So a lot of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims would go there, and they wrote about, you know, what they found in that location. So even throughout history, there was, you know, no doubt this was a location for a lot of the Buddhist teachings, and you know, part of the Buddhist Holy Land, I guess we could say. So in the future, when we go to India, then we'll make sure to stop there. So, but it is interesting to, you know, we can still find this place, and when you're reading about it, and then, you know, look it up on the map and actually track down some of these locations. So the next portion of the text, so that's the actual location. So it says, so that's the location. In the company of a great congregation of 8,000 bhikshus, there were 32,000 bodhisattvas recognized by the congregation. So here's who's listening to the texts, right? Here's how many people are there, yeah. So 8,000 monks, right? So you have 8,000 bhikshus. That's a lot, but it also tells you a lot about probably the wealth of the city. If you could sustain 8,000 monks on donations and meals, it is a pretty prosperous city. So one of the things that you probably have to keep in mind as a monk is where you're going to go begging for alms, and not to go someplace where you're putting too much of a burden on the people. So knowing that this city is quite wealthy, and there's plenty of wealth that people can set aside, this is a proper place to set up a temple. So you don't want to take 8,000 monks to, you know, the poorest village in town. It would be a tremendous burden. So you know, there's a lot of kind of thinking that goes into sort of, I guess, subtext, we could say, that's given even in just, you know, the first two sentences. So the bodhisattvas, so the question is, 32,000 bodhisattvas, were they all eating there too? And that's quite a strain and a burden. So I think it's safe to say that many of them were there in a spiritual sense. So they may not have had human bodies at the time, or would have been there metaphorically for the purpose of the teaching. But what's more important is what the text goes on to say about these bodhisattvas, and what that has to tell us about the Buddhist teaching. So right away we're going to be learning, and we find out who the audience is. So the audience is lay people, monks, and bodhisattvas. And that becomes very important for the arc of the, I guess, the rest of the story that we're going to learn as we get further into the text. So it goes on to say, the bodhisattvas present had all accomplished the original practices of great wisdom, were established by the numinous charisma of the Buddhas, maintained the correct Dharma for the defense of the Dharma city, made their names heard throughout the 10 directions through their ability at the lion's roar, befriended and pacified people without being requested, exalted the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and were thus able to keep them from being cut off. We'll start with the first line. So we have two types of formal practitioners in the audience, monks and bodhisattvas. So part of the purpose of the teaching is getting insight into what is the realization of both groups, right? So that's part of the overall story. And what do monks still need to work on? What kind of insight do bodhisattvas have? What is remaining yet for full enlightenment? And kind of inviting us to explore those ideas. So what kind of bodhisattvas, right? So that's where it starts. So the text describes several levels of bodhisattvas. So the actual levels or grounds, bodhisattva grounds, are described in the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Sarangama Sutra. So I'm not going to go so deep into those, but suffice to say that there are specific levels of attainment for the bodhisattvas that are laid out and described in the sutras, and sort of what the attainment of each of those is. So rather than go into those in depth, we'll kind of go into the text, because it actually starts with a description of what are the characteristics, what are the practices that you need to do to actually attain the bodhisattva level. So we'll kind of sum it up to say these are very high-level bodhisattvas present. Maybe just slightly below, full attainment of full awakening. Yeah.
Can you, a lot of texts, they mention bodhisattvas, obviously, and will say something about their attainment very quickly. Can you actually correlate that to the levels that are in the Sarangama Sutra and the Avatamsaka?
Yes, so the 10 bhumis, or the 10 grounds, 10 bodhisattva grounds, are described in great depth, especially in the Avatamsaka, and are laid out again in the Sarangama. They show up elsewhere as well, but that's the Avatamsaka is like the primary.
So you can say like, oh, these are level 7.
Yes, and it actually describes their attainment, and then oftentimes that is the purpose of a particular discourse in the sutra, is for the Buddha to say, you bodhisattvas here won't be able to understand because you don't have the attainment of this bodhisattva, or this bodhisattva has a deep insight, or there is a particular person answering the questions the Buddha poses because they do have that insight, or they do have that level of understanding or practice. So those levels are, if you really delve into the Avatamsaka, tremendous detail is provided, not only on what they are, but how to practice it. So it's something that you can look at both as the attainment of the bodhisattva. So we see the statues of the bodhisattvas, what is their attainment, but also how do we practice? What kind of things, what sort of behavior should we cut off? What sort of behavior should we support, encourage the development of, is very helpful in that respect, rather than just say wisdom. Can you be more specific? Well, of course, so there's, pages and pages and pages of what that type of wisdom is, or, you're kind of firmly on the path, or you have deep insight to emptiness, and then what does that really mean? So the various bodhisattva bhumis, those grounds, have that detail. So because it is tremendously detailed, we'll put that off for another day if we actually get into the Avatamsaka. But what is helpful is that I think the text, because it is focused on holding up Vimalakirti as the ideal layperson, provides you the step-by-step, what is it that the bodhisattvas have insight into. So that's kind of the next step. So the characteristics of the bodhisattva are praised. So they're not praised because the bodhisattvas need a pat on the back. They're praised so that we know what those virtues are, and then that we can emulate those virtues. So it's for our benefit, not theirs, that the Buddha praises their virtues. So it starts off, says that the bodhisattvas had all accomplished the original practices of great wisdom. So what are the original practices of great wisdom? So they had attained the insight of the Buddha, meaning these bodhisattvas are very near complete enlightenment. So these are 8th, 9th level bodhisattvas, so the highest, some of the highest levels of bodhisattvas. So they're approaching complete enlightenment, and that's going to become more important later in the text as they get into some of the ideas that the monks don't yet have a full understanding of, that a lot of lay people are don't know exist, and the Bodhisattvas are there to illustrate for people. So this is sort of the setup for the rest of the text. So it says, original practice of great wisdom established by the numinous charisma of the Buddhas. So this, what are they sustained by? So they're sustained by the teachings of the Buddhas. They have become well established in their path and practice. So what does it mean to be well established? So have you ever planted a tree? So I always notice, if you actually follow the instructions on planting a tree, you have to dig the hole like twice as deep as the root ball, and then you put other soil and stuff in the bottom, and you remove the burlap, and you wire and plant it, and then you have the little mound around it to hold water, and you water it. It takes a while for the roots to get established, right? Until it's established, it's delicate. It could easily die. And out here I notice, it's very typically, especially new construction, they'll plant a whole row of arborvitae, and then one or two die, or the whole row dies, right? So they haven't prepared the ground properly for the trees to get well established. Other ones grow forever, storms come, they're very well established. Summers, there's a drought, doesn't matter, those guys are tough. So it's a really good illustration, I think, of what it means to be well established, right? Your roots have to go deep. So in spiritual practice or Buddha sense, what roots are deep is, your knowledge of the Buddha's teaching. That has to be deep. Your basic initial foundational practices have to be firm. Otherwise, last year we had a big windstorm, or after the snow, a lot of the arborvitae kind of fell over. I actually talked to one person, it's like, nothing you can do, they're not going to come back. Other ones are still really strong because they were well established. I looked inside like, oh wow, the trunk is really thick, So it's a very well established tree. So I think it's kind of a good example of what it means to be well established. So it's saying that these bodhisattvas are very well established in their practice. They're not just starting off. They're not baby bodhisattvas, so to speak, right? They haven't just, I just developed the idea of compassion for people. No, they're very well established, so they can weather the storm. So I think that's where, especially this portion of the text is encouraging that proper foundation, and it's natural, right? When we see something that we say, I want to do that. Nobody's ever drawn to an art or a sport or something because, I want to play football because I really like the drills. No, right? People want to play football so they can score a touchdown or throw the winning pass, or they want to be a star. But to be that star, you have to run drills and win sprints and all the stuff that's painful and that doesn't show up on TV and nobody cheers for. But that's the foundational practices that are required. So that's the part that this is getting at, right? That we have to not neglect those foundations. We have to build a really good foundation. So it goes on and says, maintain the correct dharma for the defense of the dharma city. So this is kind of interesting. So we're defending the dharma city. So what is that? So what's the purpose of a city, right? People get together, common defense, you aggregate resources. A lot easier to go grocery shopping in a city than not the city. Probably wider variety of things available. But any city, think about your favorite city. Maybe it's the one you're living in right now. It's probably one of your favorite cities because it's well ordered, right? It's safe. The trash is picked up on time. The streets are clean. There's not too much dysfunction in government. Things get done. But if you look at places that you think, I probably don't want to live there, it's probably because there's a lot of dysfunction. Things are not well ordered. There may not be a very logical structure of government or authority. Maybe certain areas don't get patrolled by the police, or you're like, I don't want to go on that side of town, right? So certain cities have always impressed me because they may not even have a bad side of town. I'm like, where's the bad side of town? Like, there isn't one. Interesting. It is very well ordered. So if you compare that, what is the defense of the Dharma city? A city requires regularity, regular trash pickup, regular police patrols, regular social engagement. And the same thing with the spiritual practice. It requires regularity, regular engagement, ongoing meditation, ongoing practice. That regularity is boring, but that's what makes it beautiful, right? The same way that trash pickup isn't exciting, but we really appreciate it. So all that kind of regular maintenance, right? Then it becomes sort of invisible to you, and then you can enjoy it. So that's the kind of ongoing attention that needs to be given to our spiritual practice. This is why we do something there's some daily practice or some ongoing attention that needs to be given, right? Is to make sure that it stays nice looking, right? And that nice looking part is ourselves, our behavior, our outlook, and things like that, our happiness, right? So it has to be, like a garden, you water periodically, same thing. So it says it maintain the correct dharma. So what is the correct dharma, right? So that's a very long and detailed discussion, but it's very easy to see when the incorrect dharma is present, right? Things are falling apart. There's big problems in people's practice or organizations. You see a lot of, cracks in the walls of that city. So what's great is if we ask that question, what is the correct dharma? That's pretty much the rest of the paragraph, right? What is the actual proper practice? So that's what the text is actually going to tell us. So we don't have to go look too far. Oh, what's the proper dharma? Oh, the next sentence. Perfect. So made their names heard throughout the 10 directions through their ability at the lion's roar. Wow, these guys can roar like lions? What is this? So they have the ability to teach, right? The Bodhisattvas have this perfect ability to teach, perfect ability to give talks on the Dharma in a way that is like the lion's roar. It means it can be heard, right? People actually hear it. The words mean something. They resonate. But also, they're not afraid to teach, right? The lion isn't afraid. Why? No one's hunting him. He can be very, self-assured. He can walk around the savannah, the jungle, and he doesn't have to worry about anybody chasing him down. So in the same way, the Bodhisattvas can speak with a type of authority because they have properly cultivated. They've laid the right foundation, so they can be sure in their practices so that when they speak or they teach, they can be assured in the words they speak. So they don't have stage fright. They don't have to visualize the audience in their underwear or have some kind of, they probably don't need a teleprompter or something like that. It just comes out, right? They don't have a speechwriter, right? The first draft is the perfect draft, is the final draft, right? So this is the kind of idea of them speaking with the lion's roar. So this is helpful both for, what is the quality of the Bodhisattva, but also at the same time, how do we differ from the Bodhisattva, right? My first draft of this talk is not my final draft. Probably 10 years from now, I'll be like, oh, I could say it better or do something different. So that tells me, okay, how do I perfect? What am I working towards? So in all the different areas that I'm working, right? Not just your meditation, not just your chanting, not your interaction with people, but also in your teaching, right? How do you make it better? So it says that all of us have, where can we put effort? Where can we put work? So no stage fright. So Bodhisattvas don't have stage fright. So it says, befriended and pacify people without being requested. This one I really like. So the Bodhisattva doesn't wait for someone to ask for help. They're right there helping, right? So they have great skills of anticipation. They can see people's needs probably before they even realize there is a need, right? I think this is also a really good indication of, what kind of social engagement should Buddhists be involved in. If you see something needs doing, just do it, right? Don't wait for there to be a problem and then say, okay, how are we going to tackle the problem? My father came to visit Portland years ago, and he was really impressed because he saw just people picking up trash on the street. He said, that wasn't even their trash, and they picked it up. I said, well, yeah, people really have pride in their city, and they like it here. And he was like, wow, never seen that before, right? So I think that's the kind of, cultivating a type of insight into what the needs are. So if you think, what's the model for that? Well, who can do that? That's really hard, right? So who anticipates your need before you know you have the need and reaches out to help you? Mom, right? Mom. So mom tells you, take a jacket. You're like, why? I'm not cold. But she knows you're going to be cold later, right? So before you get cold, mom has anticipated your need and reached out to try to help you, right? So this is why we often see the regard and compassion of the Bodhisattva compared to the mother, right? So do you have the regard for sentient beings, for other people in the same way that a mother does, right? Can you cultivate compassion for sentient beings in the same way that, you know, a mother has for a small child, right? So the Bodhisattva probably sees us in that way, right? There's an element of helplessness that we have, an element of, you know, there's a lot of things that we don't know that we need, but the Bodhisattva has that anticipation. So if we can start to cultivate that anticipation, that level of regard for people, then that's the type of compassion, right? Then we know, oh, we're getting closer, right, to this goal. So have you ever been to someone's house and they really anticipate your needs? They don't say, would you like a glass of water? Just, there's the water, you know? And you're like, oh, I feel so comfortable here, right? You know? And then you leave and you're like, that interaction was so easy and smooth, right? But it's by design. It comes from the regard of the host. So there's a lot of compassion there. So that's what we're working towards. So the next sentence, exalted the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and were thus able to keep them from being cut off. So what does this mean? So the Bodhisattvas, just like in the beginning, the Buddha is praising the Bodhisattvas. The Bodhisattvas are praising the three jewels of Buddhism, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So the Buddha is the teacher, the Dharma is the teaching, and the Sangha is the community, right? The community of monks and nuns and lay people. And by doing so is able to keep them cut off. So what's the best way to safeguard something? Right? The old adage, don't keep all your eggs in one basket. So by distributing, by preaching widely, by going out in the world and actually sharing the teaching, you safeguard it, right? So if there's a hurricane in one city, it doesn't wipe out the one library with all the Buddhist texts, right? If, as has happened in world history, there is, you know, a movement to suppress or eradicate Buddhism, it survives because it's already been established in another country or another area. And so it has the opportunity to come back and sort of reseed the area that's been wiped out. So this has happened in Chinese history, it's happened in certain times in Japanese history, other parts of the world, and even in modern times, where either completely or specific groups, you know, has been wiped out. So due to historical changes in China, Shingon as a teaching no longer existed. So that school ceased to exist. And in recent times, there's been a greater interest in the Chinese-speaking communities to learn Shingon. So much so that there's a movie being made and coming out in the winter on the life of Kukai. Kukai's life in China during that time. So that's based on a novel. So it'll be fun, but not 100% historically accurate. But that's okay. Should still be fun. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. But I think it'll be helpful though, just to see, you know, what is a Chinese-made movie. What the Chinese are really good at though is researching the dress and customs and buildings and architecture of that time. So it's a really good way to look back in time. And there's actually been some areas in China that are sort of set aside just for movie making. So they actually have those streets and those areas. So we should probably see a lot of stuff where they don't need special effects. That the street exists so you can have the movie. But you know, here's that opportunity because this teaching was safeguarded in Japan, right? It spread. It has the opportunity to come back in the same way, right? Buddhism now is spreading to the United States. And one of the benefits that we have is we have every Buddhist tradition here. So if there was a problem in the host country, the country of origin, it's still here, right? Those temples are here. So we have every tradition of the world here. So that's a great benefit. So in many ways we could say, you know, the United States is a good place to safeguard the Buddhist teaching. So those are the first 3 sentences of the text. So that's what we'll wrap up for tonight. So next time we'll pick up and try to go a little bit deeper. So there is a lot of depth, but even the first paragraph of the text is a good outline of just the path and the practice. You know, what are we doing? So as we combine study with practice, so as we began today's session with meditation and chanting, you know, it's a support for us as we go forward. So we'll be archiving online. So if you miss one, that's okay. You can watch later. And you know, read ahead a little bit, but we'll be going through. So if you want to get the text or print off a couple pages and bring it with you, feel free. So.